Why a goblin? 191, Spear of Tuval, Book 4. It wasn't until a couple of hours later that someone covered in garments approached the camp with measured but quick steps. The figure didn't seem to be running particularly desperately, but they were moving fast and clearly with purpose. But to someone like Prufan, there was something particularly alarming here. The figure could be seen. Of course, it wasn't nighttime, nor was the sun hidden, and yes, the lands around the dark lands of Mir slowly took on a dark tint the closer and closer one got. But they weren't as close as of yet. So for all intents and purposes, anyone should be easily seen when approaching the camp. But either the shadows of Verdun weren't just anyone, and Prufan knew that they were the type to needlessly hide themselves and pop up in the camp out of nowhere, or at least not allow themselves to be seen until they were actually about to enter the camp. Revealing themselves from so far out, that was unlike them. Eventually, the figure in question closed the distance in full and was quickly ushered into the command tent where Prufan and his nephew were waiting. "You are late, young shadow." The figure did not even bother to react to that comment and instead began to give the report it was tasked with delivering. The goblins have enacted a series of ambushes and direct confrontations, but a pattern was quickly noticed. All of their tactics are geared towards fighting mindless beasts. There are no traps that appear to have more than one layer. Effective for a time, but simple in the end. Prufan rubbed his chin as he contemplated the information. He wasn't really expecting that type of report from the shadows of Verdun, but this was useful. If the goblins didn't know to plan around other sentient and crafty minds, then that would likely be their downfall. Or at least that's what Prufan currently believed. To a point. "Well, I'm sure you learned a lot more than that about our new green friends there, young shadow. Tell me everything." From there, the figure quickly and clearly elaborated in detail about the events that have taken place in the forests he just ran from. By the end of it all, Prufan had a small frown on his face. The figure had left the second it finished giving all the necessary details, so it was only Prufan and Grafai remaining in the text at the moment. "The goblins are not as simple as I thought. What do you think about all of it?" Grafai considered the question for a moment before delivering his answer. "This is not something I am familiar with, Uncle. The strongest goblin that I've ever fought, let alone seen, was probably Tier 1, and it was nothing more than a simple beast. I have never heard of a tribe of goblins displaying this level of coordination and power. We must not underestimate them further, Uncle." Do not bother sending our scouts at all. Based on what our little shadow friend said, the forests closer to Mir are nothing but a death trap. Simple, straightforward tactics, but quite effective, since the half the shadows who entered will not be coming back. It's been a long time since I've heard those creepy bastards take a loss of that nature. Serves them right for trying to incite problems in our great country all those years ago. Uncle. Bah, don't even bother. Anyway, we will use the fact that they clearly have never experienced a war against humans who could not only scheme, but act on the fly as well. The goblins are strong, but we can use that to our advantage. Make sure the Harkies are well fed and ready to go. Once the rest of the force gets here, I will push for a quick departure. The goblins might not know how to properly plan against humans for now, but I would rather not give them time to learn. Yes, Uncle. You know you can disagree, right? You are a damn Hark. Even Her Majesty will have to listen to your counsel. I understand, Uncle. Prufan continued to spew harmless curses at his nephew in an effort to get him to be more commanding, as someone in his position should be. The command tent wasn't stopping any of the sounds from coming out, so a lot of the other Balerians could overhear Prufan yelling, but no one batted an eye at his behavior. This was normal and had been happening for years. In fact, it was widely known throughout North Balerion about the type of man High Hark Grafai was. He was someone who earned fame from the time he was a child. All the family members of the Old Fang, Prufan had been in the limelight at some point in time, just due to their relation to the living legend. But when Grafai first showed his talent for riding and battle, his fame only grew from there. Although there wasn't any major continental war recently, that didn't mean there wasn't plenty of enemies and other factions and groups casing problems around the continent. One didn't have to look very far to find a minor conflict, especially when beasts only needed to be hungry enough to attack settlements. It was these types of battles that Graphi quickly proved his worth in and eventually began to separate from his peers. His uncle, of course, spared no knowledge from him and even groomed him to reach the heights he now sat at. Everything was perfect, except for the fact that Graphi hated attention, hated interacting with people more than necessary, and seemingly sought to answer questions in as few words as possible if he could. Even when it came time to bestow the title of High Hark to him, his tried to turn it down and probably would have managed to succeed in doing so if his uncle hadn't beaten him with a stick until he said yes. Not a single attack form his uncle harmed him, but it grew too annoying to deal with. That was Graphi. But while he was reserved man in most situations, on the battlefield, him and his mount were nothing short of reapers sent to claim lives. And he wouldn't be the only figure of similar power and renown joining the battle against the goblins. For the Knights of Tuval could be seen riding to the camp. At their forefront was single woman, one that hailed from the same generation as Prufan. But unlike Prufan, who stalled at Tier 6, she sat firmly at the peak of the 7th tier, known by her family as Hersha, but to her enemies and anyone else for that matter, she was the Spear of Tuval, a truly ferocious woman. 192. Politics, Book 4. The Knights of Tuval quickly joined the camp and didn't waste any time in making their own preparations for temporary lodging. Like the reed. The Knights of Tuval quickly joined the camp and didn't waste any time in making their own preparations for temporary lodging. Like the Riders of Balerion, only one real command tent was set up, just for the sake of having a central planning location. The main difference between the two was the fact that Tuval's main strategist would not be sleeping in this tent. The Spear of Tuval would of course be leading her knights head first into battle. But that was still to come. Currently, she was standing with a small frown on her aged face after just hearing the update on the situation from Prufan. So they are truly not mindless brutes then. She paused as if to make sure next words would have the impact she desired, then continued, but it changes nothing. We will put them to the blade and eliminate their so-called king before the week is over. Of course, Graphi said nothing, but Prufan simply shook his head. Yes, we will kill them all, no problem. Why don't we wait for the others to arrive so that we can make a proper plan to accomplish that? The Spear of Tuval only rendered a simple nod in Prufan and Graphi's directions before leaving the tent altogether. As the day went on, more and more individuals began to arrive, and the camp quickly grew in size as 10,000 troops, and who knows how many more support and logistics personnel began to flood in. A lot more tents were erected, and plenty of stations for on-the-fly blacksmithing, potion work, and anything and everything needed for a proper staging ground before a war. From this point, there would be no retreat. They would either return from this camp with the head of a goblin king as a prize, or instead never return at all. That was understood in detail by all of them, except for perhaps the non-fighters. Anyway, after the arrival of the archers from Liasanti, who were the last to arrive, a proper strategic meeting was held, with all the relevant leaders. All of the nations who participated in the GES were now here and on the countdown to war. And since those present were warriors and not diplomats, the command meeting was far more intense than that of the GES. There is no need for this foolishness. You all might be scared of a few monsters, but the Knights of Tuval fear nothing. This is a war, not a chance for you to play your political games. The word spoken by the Spear of Tuval was of course directed at the representative of the Blue Sky Federation. Although he had the strength and battle experience to lay a claim to the title of warrior, he was not here in a fighting capacity. The Blue Sky Federation were responsible for supplying the entire group with whatever it was they needed. They covered the costs for it and are there to ensure that the reason the battle is lost will not be due to a lack of resources. Of course, all the parties involved made sure to bring their own supplies and goods, but it was a major benefit to not having to travel with an entire logistics department on their own. The problem now was that the representative of the Blue Sky Federation, a man by the name of the Tews, had his own ideas about how the supplies should be divided up, especially when it came to one particular group. Tews grit his teeth and he quickly scanned the room for support, and after realizing he had none, all he could do was click his tongue and relent in idea he was pushing. He wanted to charge the demi-humans for the use of the items they would take from him. The demi-humans did not take this lying down, and a heated discussion quickly took rise. But before it could grow in any more intensity, Hersha, the spear of the Tuval kingdom, shot it down. Now, while some of the other nations likely wouldn't have stepped in on behalf of the demi-humans, at least not initially, Tuval was close to the demi-human border. They weren't necessarily allies or even all that friendly with each other, but Hersha in particular was a no-nonsense type of woman. And in her mind, not only was this act dishonorable in her eyes as a knight of Tuval, it also wouldn't serve her nation well to rile up the demi-humans further. Now, in terms of support, there wasn't a single soul in the room who would choose to antagonize the spear of Tuval needlessly. The elven woman gave a curt nod in the direction of Hersha, who returned it, and the situation was quickly put to bed. Ahem, now that politics are out of the way, why don't we get back to planning how to complete the reason we were all gathered in the first place? The Goblin King. Remember? Seeing that he now had the attention of everyone in the tent, Prufan continued on with Graphi standing solemnly beside his uncle. Prufan might have been a legend in the lands of North Belarian, but as the weakest in a tent with other figures who had their own claim to fame, he was nothing much. But allowing disrespect to befall his uncle was not on the list of activities Graphi had planned for the day. If anyone had such thoughts, they would simply face the talons of his Harkonian. From there, an entire strategic plan was drawn out. The main attack plan itself was actually really simple. The Knights of Tuval and the Knights of Verdun would be engaging in a simple frontal assault. It was what they trained for, and it would be how they knew best to fight. The voices in the tent saw no reason to stray away from that. Where things would get a bit tricky for the goblins was how everyone else would come into the battle, especially when one considered that the shadows of Verdun and the members of the Black Wolf tribe were still in those forests even now. Needless to say, the goblins were in store for a few surprises. 193. Hope, Book 4. While the different factions had gathered in full and were planning their assault on the goblin tribes to kill their king, the goblins themselves hadn't been stagnant. They too were coming up with plans of their own. They've retreated, you say? Chief Galgo looked over towards Chief Gruel, who provided the report. Yes, every single one of them has left the forest that surrounds us, both the wolves and the humans. Chich, I still think it would have been better to just kill them all right then and there. Roga, we have talked about this. It is best that we save all of our options until it is time. The humans should have a much better idea of our strength due to the one we allowed to escape, so let's not confirm their suspicions just yet. We did enough. Half of them will sleep forever in the dark lands of Mir, and the other half will dream about it. Let's focus on what comes next. What else did you find, Gruel? There is a large group of humans outside of our forests. I wasn't able to get an accurate number just due to how many powerful presences I could feel from the camp, but there were thousands of them. Thousands. And I think more or less the same amount of Tier 7 beings as us. If there was one above Tier 7, then I wasn't strong enough to find them. And just like the group that just ran from the forest, there are both demi-humans and humans mixed into the camp. That's all I could gather from a distance without exposing myself. Silence descended in the room after Chief Gruel finished giving his report. All the chiefs had already been preparing for a grim situation, but actually hearing just how grim of a situation they found themselves in would also be a sort of dampener. More or the same amount of Tier 7 beings was essentially saying that they would be matched for peak power. That alone would disrupt most of the best-case scenarios they could plan for themselves. If they were matched in number, then it would mean that they would also have to fend for themselves on the battlefield. There would be no help coming to save them, and their life and death would be in their own hands. But that wasn't the problem. They were 14 chiefs of the dark lands of Mir. It was only right that they were first in the line to battle, and every single one of them was ready to lay down their lives if it meant one more goblin would live to see another day. This was their responsibility, especially since all of them had drunk the blood of the king. Something like that came with the pressure of race as well. To be so privileged that they could be chosen to advance to the 7th tier. So no, their battles weren't the problem. The problem was the other goblins. Their enemies would not wait for the chiefs to conclude their battles. No, it was likely that their entire force would be attacking at once, and with the chiefs preoccupied, it would be up to the other goblins to fight their own battles just like the chiefs were doing. This was always going to happen. They knew a long time ago that the other goblins would have to fight their own battles. That is why they were being pushed so hard. That is why they were allowed to fight all those knights who invaded not that long ago. They all knew and they prepared for it. But that didn't mean they had to like it, especially since they knew that Rick, their king, would not be happy about the loss of life. After a few more moments were spent collecting themselves, a robust planning session took place. They went into this planning session with two goals in mind. Two very simple ones at that. Survive and keep the death count as low as possible. The first goal was because of something they were ashamed to admit. Defeating the attackers and forcing them to retreat in full would likely be far too big of a challenge for them at this point. They were confident that they wouldn't be defeated after just a few days of battle, but to win the battle was another story. One they weren't sure would reach a happy ending, so they would focus on survival. With the goal, of course, being that they would survive until their king returned. Although not a single one of them wanted him to leave and face so much danger without them being there, they all had the utmost amount of confidence in their king. There was not a shred of doubt in their minds that their king would return to them. He would return. They were sure of it. And not only would he return, but he would be stronger than ever before. Strong enough to destroy those who dared to invade the dark lands of Mir in search of his head. So it would be their job as his chiefs to ensure that there were still 14 goblin clans to be protected when the king returned. He was doing his part, and they would do theirs. It was that simple. The goblins continued their planning efforts through the night, and by the end of it all, one thing would be clear. No chief would be able to spare the time to watch over the front lines anymore. If they were going to be matched in power, then it wouldn't be smart to weaken themselves even further. No matter what, a sacrifice had to be made somewhere, and they had deemed the front lines the place where it would be. Thankfully for the goblins, it wasn't just Commander Migra who managed to advance to the 6th tier. There were more than a few others who now claimed that tier. It would be up to 3 from that new batch of Tier 6 goblins to handle the front lines. If for some reason the rare occurrence of a Tier 7 showing up there happened, then they would have no choice but to hold on until help arrived. Of course, they factored in the possibility that their king should be stirring up a storm deeper within the dark lands of Mir by now. Hopefully, that meant any prospective Tier 7s would be too distracted to attack. That was all they could do. Hope. 194. GES Mages, Book 4. While the leaders of each respective force made their decisions, those who would have to follow those decisions without fail were conducting preparations of their own. One of those individuals, or better yet, one of those groups, was a particular division of knights in one of the knight orders that hailed from the Verdan kingdom. While every single one of them were knights tried and true, and every single one of them wielded the sword with the great expertise expected of knights of the Verdan kingdom, they would be a failure of a premier knight order if all they could do was fight with the sword. With that being said, there was a division of mages that was preparing themselves, as a few orders had already come down the pipeline for them. That wraps up the mission ahead of us. Any questions? There were about 100 other knights sitting around the speaker, a Tier 6 knight by the name of Keisha. She was the leader of this particular division of mages within the Knight Order. It was her responsibility not only to pass along orders from the top, but to ensure in the midst of battle that her mages were organized properly. Of course, there were other logistical tasks and things involving group morale that she was responsible for as well, but those were her primary points of focus. So all we are doing is just raining down hell for as long as possible. One of the members raised her hand and asked something that a few of them were thinking. Keisha answered, "That is exactly what we will be doing. We don't know their exact numbers, but it is well known how quickly goblins can reproduce, so our main job is to cull their numbers as much as possible before the melee begins. We will rain down all that we can on them without mercy." What about retaliation? I've never seen one before, but it was reported that the goblins have something akin to a subrace of goblin mages. How do we plan on handling them? That is correct. If no one else has read the mission briefings, then yes, the goblins do have a subrace of goblin mages. They are reportedly taller and more slender. Where they lack in physical might, they make up for it with magical dominance, or so the report says. I find it hard to believe their rudimentary spells could compare to centuries of history in the Verdan kingdom alone, but we will treat them as such. Expect a large amount of mana being flung in our direction, just as much as we are throwing toward them. The group digested the words from Keisha for a moment, and then someone asked a question. We know they have goblins of the 7th tier. Are any of them mages? Information on their 7th tier goblins was not really abundant. If the reinstated minister provided more information to the king, then it was not passed down to someone like me. It won't be long until we find out, so just focus on what we do know and what we can control. Based on how the situation progresses, we will adapt in battle. After that, another string of discussions began as their actual positions were discussed, the rough directions that each mage should be levying their attacks in, and even which mages would be responsible for shields. In war, there wouldn't be much time for glaring mistakes to be corrected, so it was best that a lot of potential decisions were handled up front. Things like accidentally having half of the mages firing in the exact same place and leaving an entire swath of the forest untouched simply couldn't happen. So this was the time for things like that to be corrected. Even if the exact situation discussed didn't actually happen, as long as it was similar to something else, they would be able to adapt to the situation far more easily. Once all of those decisions were made, or at least drafted to a point, a much wider discussion took place. First with their fellow knight orders from the Verdan kingdom, then with those of the Tuval kingdom, since they would likely be in very similar positions to those of Verdan. Then the entire force as a whole began to pass around information regarding the positioning of any ranged mage units and the type of attacks that would ensue. Not only were positions and directions discussed, but so too were timings. It would do far more harm than good if the advancing party of knights had to also dodge attacks from their own people. At some point while discussions were taking place, the remaining individuals who made up the Shadows of Verdan and those of the Black Wolf tribe returned to the group. If no one knew about the losses they suffered in the forests before this point, it would be hard to guess that they suffered any losses at all. There wasn't a hint of moping or signs of anything even loosely related to it. This was a profession where death was commonplace, and they weren't in the type of position to cry and react to such things in the midst of a mission. They were trained better than that. Of course, there were still a few of them scattered around the area to keep an eye on things, but for the most part, they were all now resting in some corner of the camp. Most of them were covered from head to toe in black garments, as it wouldn't be a good idea for their identities to be leaked to the entire group. But with their return, a new round of information was passed around for the mages and everyone else in the camp to make use of. Positioning and the places the goblins seemed to focus their defenses on, among other things. By the time the day was over, Keisha and everyone else who shared her position had finalized their plans in full. Tomorrow will be the day. Tomorrow will be the day that the entire force will finally enter the forest in full and lay waste to everything in sight. Or at least that will be their goal. And while the mages of the GES group got ready for their own march into the dark lands of Mir, the Maglins of the 14 Goblin clans were doing much of the same. 195. Above the 7th, Book 4. Today was the day. The members of the GES were never going to wait around for a long time once they gathered. Not only was it best to get this over with so that something like an alliance between demi-humans and humans could end, but it was also act before it was too late. The shock around the existence of goblins of the 7th tier was not one easily forgotten. Every single one of the powers gathered as part of the GES had at least one individual higher than the 7th tier in some way, shape, or form. Some of them had more than just one. That meant all of them knew of power that someone so strong could hold. Once you reached above the 7th tier, fights were no longer as simple as just the tier you were in. In most cases, it actually little to do with it. There were many more potentially catastrophic ideas at play when it came to discussing powers above the 7th tier. Although Rick and his chiefs believed that all they had to do was come together and sacrifice themselves to potentially stop someone at 8th tier from killing them all, they couldn't be further from the truth. For those who knew of the power that begins at the 8th tier commanded, all of them had a saying amongst them. The saying itself was different across different races and communities, but the fact remains that all of them shared one. The 7th tier is the highest a man can reach. It was simple. So simple that if it was heard by those who were not necessarily aware of the chasm that existed between the 7th and 8th tiers, then would only think the person who spoke it was ignorant or just didn't know better. The number of tiers were so commonly spread that even the goblins who didn't speak any spoken languages of the continent knew of them. So it was hard to blame someone for hearing that saying and thinking to themselves that the speaker just lived under a rock for some reason. But to those who knew, they knew how true such a statement was. No one who managed to climb above the 7th tier was a simple man anymore. So, while those individuals couldn't simply leave their countries to join the battle that was about to take place, their subordinates would make sure to approach the battle with the right mindset. For a goblin cannot be allowed to even attempt such a climb. Never. It mustn't happen lest those on the continent face certain doom. Of course, this was mostly baseless conjecture, but the powers at me knew far more than they were letting on. Though even if they knew more, there was still the fact that goblins were seen as pests all around the continent. Just how many of them were killed on a regular basis for the simplest of reasons. Goblins didn't even have the reputation of being evil or aggressive in the same way as orcs did, for example. The orcs were known as an aggressive race of beasts that fought violently at the slightest bit of inconvenience. Goblins, on the other hand? There was nothing of the sort when it came to the rumors surrounding them, at least not on a continental scale. Perhaps some goblins in a few places managed to reach the 3rd tier, and instead of running away from humans, for example, they fought to defend themselves and killed a few. In a situation like that, it would be quite easy to paint goblins as villains, but it would only be for that area and its surroundings. For the most part, goblins simply stuck to their small tribes and hunted for food in nearby areas. Yet some of them were killed all the same, for whatever reason. Wouldn't the king of goblins have a problem with that? Wouldn't the king of goblins want revenge for all the lives his people taken? If such a being with a mentality like that was allowed to reach the 8th tier, it would be nothing short of the apocalypse in the eyes of many. The level of effort it would require to kill him at that point would guarantee the deaths of many, especially if the Goblin King was ready to sacrifice his life to kill his enemies. Or at least that was how some people thought. Either way, it didn't matter all that much. Now that the battle was here and ready to begin in full, the reasonings no longer carried real weight. War was war. Bloodshed was bloodshed. Death was death. It didn't matter what or why things reached this point, only that this was now reality. The members of the GES would march into the dark lands of Mir with their only goal being to knock the goblins down a peg and the killing of their king. While the goblins would do their best to kick who they see as invaders out of their lands and delay enough for their king to return. War was war. Bloodshed was bloodshed. Death was death. 10,000 troops poured into the forests in loose formations according to the battle plans and strategies that the leaders of the combined forces came up with, which left the Night Orders from Tuval and Verdun essentially combining into one large group as they moved towards their destination. This battle wouldn't be taken place in the open fields, and trees were everywhere, so they weren't in the tight ranks expected of a Night Order, but they were still together. And Keisha, along with all of her fellow mages, were along with their respective Night Orders. It would be their responsibility to officially kick off this important war with an opening salvo that the goblins would remember for a lifetime. Now, since the advancing force wasn't doing anything to hide their advances into the forest, especially the advance of the Night Orders who were front and center of the advancing party, it wasn't very hard to take notice of them. In fact, that was the exact intention of the strategy being implemented here. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the goblins to come out full force and attack them for coming into their home to kill their king. In their minds, it would be even more perfect if the Goblin King himself were to show up and denounce them if he wanted. Unfortunately for them, though, the goblins would not give them what they wanted. The members of the GES were noticed long before they actually made their way deeper into the dark lands of Mir, and the goblins planned to welcome them appropriately. It was only right that one treated visiting dignitaries with the respect they deserved after all. 196 Stupid Things. Book 4. While his goblins were beginning the battle for their survival, Rick was doing his best to get strong enough to be a factor on the battlefield. Both he and Commander Migra had nearly lost their lives many times by now. There were even a few occasions when both of them had accepted the fact they would be dying, only to somehow escape or turn the tides of battle at the last second. It was a sort of dance they found themselves in, one on the knife's edge of death. The humor in all of it was gone now, and the lively energy that Rick had when he first entered had dissipated as well. From the beginning, that liveliness in Rick was nothing but a mask to not only ease the mind of Commander Migra, but also help him to not focus on the fact that his people could be getting slaughtered right this second. Rick knew for a fact that he was taking a massive risk by leaving and seeking strength. There was no doubt about that, but he truly felt that he didn't have a choice in the matter. Of course, on one hand, someone could make the argument that he would still be effective in the battle even as a Tier 6 Royal Goblin. There was no secret he could punch above his weight, and it could be something of a tipping point in the battle. Plus, there were his flames. An ability that simultaneously empowered allies whilst weakening the enemy was one that could also play a deciding factor in any battle. It also couldn't be ignored, the type of motivating factor his presence would be for the goblins. They would rally around him with the intensity and passion expected of warriors fighting alongside their king. It was the type of mental aspect that simply couldn't be quantified properly. With all of these factors at play, there was a very real argument for Rick to stay and fight. Yet Rick still decided to leave, because of the reasons he made very clear to his chiefs. Ones that were extremely valid when looking at the bigger picture. He was the target. The entire GES force would be doing their best to eliminate him. They were already at a disadvantage in overall quality of troops. There were far more than 10,000 goblins in the dark lands of Mir, but the goblins themselves would be the first to tell you that throwing a bunch of Tier 1s and 2s against Tier 4s was like throwing a pebble at a massive wall. It would hit the wall, maybe it would even leave a little scratch, but the wall would stand. It wouldn't even budge. Of course, if you had enough time and pebbles, eventually there would come a day when the pebbles won just due to wearing down the wall, but this wasn't that type of story. The goblins had neither time nor enough pebbles to attack the wall that they were facing. Perhaps Rick's presence would have helped to make a bigger dent into the wall initially, but eventually they would encircle Rick and his goblins like a hare stuck in a ditch as foxes closed in on it. So a decision had to be made, and Rick made his. Migra, how is it? Commander Migra, who was currently being carried by Rick on his back, grit her teeth tightly and barely squeezed out a reply. Please forgive me, my king, for being so helpless that you need to carry me. Perhaps if it was back when they had just entered the dark lands of Mir, Rick might have been quick to cut her off and tell her she never needed to apologize for something like this. But he was too tired. Just talking at all was draining enough. There was no need to spend it saying things that weren't vital, or at least what Rick thought was vital. Clearly, both he and Migra had different definitions of the word. No, Migra. How do you feel? Once again, she spoke through gritted teeth. I will survive for now, my king. Good, that's good. Commander Migra closed her eyes tightly as she listened to the weak and tired voice that belonged to her king. Even though resting on his back felt nothing short of comfortable and safer than anywhere else in the world, more than any of that, she felt shame. A significant amount of shame at that. In all honesty, she knew every single goblin in the Darklands of Mir would probably all fight for the position of being carried by their king like this. His back was as wide as it was firm, and regardless of tier and age, all of them would feel safe here, even the big ones. But Migra could not allow herself to feel the same way. She was not a regular goblin. She was not only a member of the Royal Guard, but she was also their commander. They were an entirely separate force of goblins within the dark lands of Mir. They obeyed no chief, they no longer called anyone clan home, and most of all, they were both the first and the last line of defense for their king. Before their king could die, every single one of them would have to be dead first. Death is a small price to pay. That was the vow she took, and it was one that she took with utmost seriousness. If Rick couldn't walk, it was because she had lost her legs already. If Rick couldn't swing his spear, it was because she had lost her arms already. If Rick couldn't see, it was because she had lost her head already. That was what she believed in. Yet time and time again, it was Rick, her king, who was putting himself in harm's way just to save her. Stop thinking stupid things, Migra. Yes, my king. Rick continued to walk forward with Migra on his back. They had only just finished a battle against something that looked to be a blend of a deer and bear all in one. Of course, it was another Tier 7 creature, and one that might have been close to the peak of the tier. It was the reason why Rick felt so weak and why Migra could not walk. Even though he took breaks on the recommendation of Valora, Rick was still required to spam the use of his active skills, even when he was already running on empty in the stamina and mana department. It was part of the reason why Migra felt so ashamed. Rick should be resting. He needed it more than ever, but here he was, carrying her and walking. But Rick would have it no other way. He was a king, and his people needed him. 197. Cat and Mouse, Book 4. Rick and Commander Migra had finally reached a place where they felt they could rest for a few minutes. It was a small valley covered, and they bunkered down inside, hoping that some sleeping monster wasn't waiting for them. Thankfully for them, that wasn't the case, and they could finally catch their breaths for a few moments. Show me my status, Valora. Status, name, Rick, age, 22, race, Goblin King, tier, 6, strength, 470, agility, 290, dexterity, 295, intelligence, 170, endurance, 400, mana pool, 5/1800, essence, 0, evo points, 0, 53,050 over 90,720, skills, Valora, Ruknar, Will of the King, Kaldrez. Even after all of that fighting, we are still so far away from our goal. Do the math for me, Valora. Exactly how many Tier 7s would I need to kill to reach max Evo points? Killing roughly 8 Tier 7 beings will be enough to get you to max Evo points. 8 Tier 7s. I don't even know if I could find that many beings of the 7th tier, let alone fight and kill all of them in a short time. Has this journey of mine been pointless after all? The whole point was to reach the 7th tier so that I could properly defend my people from the humans. Yet the further I go, the farther my goal appears. Maybe it's time to pack up shop and go back. What do you think, Valora? Perhaps if this was at the beginning of your journey, I would have been an advocate for you to return to the support of the clans. That time has now passed. You have been here for too long, and you have made significant progress. Going back when you are less than halfway to your goal would be something of a waste. My recommendation is to simply change your approach. Change my approach? How? Well, instead of hunting them one by one and engaging in a life-and-death battle one after another, I think it would be best if you simply lured a few together and took care of them all at once. Valora, that honestly sounds like a terrible idea. Fighting just one of those monsters was already putting my life at risk beyond reason. Now you're suggesting that I fight a group of them at the same time. I don't know about that one. That would be true if you kept on fighting them in barbaric fashion like how you've done thus far. But what I propose is a real plan, and it would require a lot of preparation. Ahem. How much prep time are we talking? A few days' worth? A few days' worth, huh? And what if we attract trouble while doing a few days' worth of prep? Then it saves you the task of going out to find enemies if they came to you. Though I believe if there were any Tier 7s close by, then they would have long since come out to attack you. Will I need Migra for this plan to work? It would be better if she was there, but I'm sure you could manage. Though you do not need her to prepare for the battle ahead. All right, we'll try this plan of yours. Allow me to rest for a bit, then we'll begin on prep. In the meantime, please go over the plan in detail. So, Valora then spent the next few hours going over the plan she came up with as both Rick and Migra rested. Then, once Rick had a good understanding of the plan in full, he set out to prepare the things Valora requested of him. Perhaps if he was still a Tier 1 goblin, then these preparations wouldn't take just a few days. It would instead be weeks, if not months, of hard labor if he were to do it all by himself. Yet although it was far quicker than a Tier 1 goblin's progress would have been, it still took Rick an entire 7 days' worth of work to complete all the preparations. Part of the reason for that was due to the fact that he made quite a bit of noise in the surrounding areas, and thus a lot of beasts were attracted to the area. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which lens one looks through, none of the attackers were above Tier 6. which meant defeating them was an easy task for Rick, even if he had to also cover for Migra, who was still in need of deep recovery, though this was not something he would ever complain about. It was his duty to protect her, despite how she felt, and he would see that it was one he didn't fail. Which is why, although he finished all the necessary preparations in 7 days, he didn't actually depart from their little hiding spot till the 10th day had passed. By then, Migra was able to move around. She was nowhere near being fully recovered, but she was fit enough to stay hidden and fight back if needed. Rick, on the other hand, Rick had a bit of a job to do. It would be up to him to not only go find these Tier 7 beasts, but also to lead them back to the location where everything was prepared for them. Now, Rick and Valora had long since noticed something about these Tier 7 beasts. First of all, they didn't seem like they were very focused on making a desperate push to reach the exit of Mir. On top of that, they didn't have the same level of mindlessness that the lower tiers had. Which meant, or at least to Rick and Valora, it meant that if the Tier 7s were to get near each other, then there was a chance that they would ignore Rick and simply fight each other. Of course, if that were to happen, the plan Valora concocted would simply go to waste, but that didn't bother them at all. Rick then spent roughly the next 2 days in search of Tier 7 monsters. He managed to find 3. Once that was completed, he took some time to plan out a route between all 3 so that he could efficiently lure all of them. Then, it was time to play a cat-and-mouse game with 3 beings strong enough to rip him in half. All in a day's life of Rick the Goblin King, though. 198. Pitfalls, Book 4. Once Rick officially planned out his route between all 3 targets, the task of luring them all to the same location was now upon him. It wasn't easy doing so, but he somehow managed to successfully stay close enough to his pursuers that the chase would be worth it long enough to draw them all in. Now the monsters were clearly not on friendly terms with one another, and if Rick wasn't present, then perhaps upon running into one another in the pursuit of Rick, they would have immediately began a brutal environment-shaping battle without a second of hesitation. But apart from a few roars and what was essentially a shoulder bump every time they neared each other while chasing Rick, the 3 beasts seemed far more engrossed with the target of their chase than the other way around. They wanted him, and if they were to come to blows, then it would be because another one of them was about to claim the kill on Rick for themselves. Rick, on the other hand, was running for his life. No longer was he trying to keep them behind him as he ran around to the next target. This time he was actually running as fast as his Tier 6 body could carry him. Thankfully, he was at a point where his body didn't feel like it was killing itself from the inside anymore, due to everything he put his body through since he ventured this far deep into the dark lands of Mir. It would take more than a few days of rest to get him back to peak strength. But he didn't have that amount of time. What he had now was enough, though, and if it wasn't, then it would simply have to be. As with 3 monsters chasing him, there was no time or room for anything else. He ran and ran and ran until he was finally back at the site he painstakingly prepared according to Valora's little plan. The plan in question. I can't believe your great plan was nothing but a pitfall trap. We are on a time crunch, and so is our information. In a situation like there isn't much we can do in terms of complex plans. A pitfall trap is simple enough to be enacted without too much thought. If executed right, it is something that can be very effective against multiple opponents that all lack effective cognitive abilities. It matches our situation almost to a T. Of course, the pitfall trap will not be nowhere near enough kill our targets, but it should put you in a much more favorable position to defeat them, especially with the other items we have prepared. I wasn't doubting the plan, Valora, just surprised since a pitfall trap is one of the oldest tricks in the book. It was something so simple that it didn't cross my mind for even a second. If I didn't agree with its effectives, I wouldn't have bothered with digging that big-ass hole, though I appreciate the explanation. Ignoring Valora's embarrassment for now, Rick finally neared the pitfall trap, and after flexing his legs for a briefer moment, he leapt over the massive uncovered hole. Rick didn't have time to find foliage big enough to cover both length and width of the hole, but with how dark things were in the forest anyway, Rick hoped there would be no need for it. And thankfully he was right. 2 of the 3 monsters chasing after him fell directly into the hole, while the third one tried to leap over it, only to be immediately met with a Ruknar-empowered strike of the spear that slammed it down into the hole. Then something Rick really hoped for happened. The monsters didn't immediately just jump out of the hole. Instead, they began biting and clawing at each other with real intensity, unlike when they were chasing Rick. It was much easier for them to ignore each other when the wide-open forest was around them. Rick was running away. But Rick, rather Valora, was smart. While the hole was wide, it wasn't wide enough that they could all sit in the hole comfortably. Using his knowledge of the body sizes of the Tier 7 monsters he'd fought before, Rick made the hole wide enough for them to fit, but still have rub bodies with each other. That was apparently unacceptable to them. Rick and thankfully Commander Migra didn't let that moment go without action. The other item prepared by Rick on the input of Valora was a couple tree logs. Rick didn't have time to make the pretty, but he made sure to sharpen at least one end of 8 different trees that he used his spear to cut at the base. He grabbed 2 of them, while Migra grabbed 1. With roaring yells, both Rick and Migra threw the sharpened trees with everything they had at the targets below. Due to how much of the hole the bodies of the beasts filled up, there was no need to even focus on aiming. All 3 logs struck true, and the beasts who were struck cried out in pain. Rick then promptly poured out his flames in full in the hole, and once more again the cries of the beasts poured out in the surrounding forest as the flames seeped into their wounds. Back off and focus on support Migra. Unlike in the past, there was no room for complaining about Maid to back off anymore. Even if she didn't like it, and she definitely didn't, Migra knew that fighting directly alongside Rick would only cause more harm than good. And after seeing the result of their attacks in the hole, even she could agree that it was time to retreat. The monsters weren't interested in fighting each other anymore. Now they were out for blood. Although striking them with the logs was truly damaging, and pouring the flames on top of them only increased the damage dealt, that simply wouldn't be enough to claim the lives of all 3 of them. Not that Rick thought it would. There was a reason why he made the hole far deeper than it was wide. Of course, Rick didn't have a shovel to dig, but when one punch was enough to cause a crater to form, a few more of them was all it took to make a truly deep hole. So when the monsters attempted to climb up, he and his spear was right there waiting for them. Needless to say, Rick claimed the lives of 3 more Tier 7s in that moment. 199. Return of the King, Book 4. It took him 3 more days after that initial battle, but Rick managed to complete his task. Every bit of essence required to evolve to Tier 7 was now finally gathered and absorbed. Show me my status, Valora. I need to see it. Understood. Status. Name, Rick. Age, 22. Race, Goblin King. Tier, 6. Strength, 470. Agility, 290. Dexterity, 295. Intelligence, 170. Endurance, 400. Mana pool, 800/1800. Essence, 0. Evo points, 90,720/90,720. Evolve, skills, Velora, Ruknar, Will of the King. Khaldrez. Finally, we can go home now. Yes, and I advise you to hurry. We have spent far too long here. Based on the reports that were available when we left, the war should have long since begun by now. I know, trust me. Commander Migra. We are leaving. Yes, my king. Migra and Rick didn't waste any time after that, and immediately began sprinting back to Goblin-controlled lands. Of course, because they were now throwing caution to the wind, they picked up a lot of attention from all manner of beasts seeking them. But there was no time for fighting or anything of the sort. Rick and Migra simply ran with all they had. And at their level of strength, that was blistering compared to what was chasing them. And since they were not holding anything back, the time that it took for them to reach Goblin-controlled lands versus the time it took to reach as far as they did was only 1 day. 1 full day of sprinting was all it took for them to make the journey back. Once they neared one of the fronts, they had no choice but to skirt around thousands of enemies at that point. But they were weak and posed no threat. Especially not when the goblins that remained on the front noticed who it was that was rapidly approaching from behind the ranks of enemies. The king! The king has returned to us. Loud shouts went up all around the front as Rick quickly made his way past the enemies and behind lines of safety. Protect me. That was all he said to know in particular, before quickly accepting the prompt to evolve and beginning his evolution to Tier 7 right then and there. Rick would have loved to run all the way back to his house and complete the evolution there, but he saw the state of front. The number of goblins that should be guarding it was lower than it probably should have been. Far too low. There also wasn't a single Tier 6 goblin on the front at all. To make matters worse, Rick couldn't even sense the presence of a chief in the area. He took solace in the fact that the front was still being guarded in the first place, but he realized this was no time to worry about evolving in any type of comfort. The situation was clearly not favorable, and every second wasted is a second in which the situation could become even more unfavorable. There was also the fact that he had no idea just how long this evolution was going to take, so there was time to waste. Migra noticed the situation as well, but she had no choice but to have one of the goblins around her send word to wherever the royal guards were. She didn't the full scope of everything that was going on, but the fact of the matter is, Rick could never be allowed to die. As long as he was alive, the goblins would rise again. As long as he was allowed to grow, then everything would be all right. So she stood fast around the unmoving body of the king as work quickly spread throughout the 14 goblin clans that Rick had not only returned, but he had begun his evolution to the 7th tier. What Rick and Migra didn't know was how badly the news of the return of Rick was needed. The situation at the front was barely a glance at the reality of the state of the war at the moment. To understand, one would have to go back a number of days. Back to when Rick had just reached Valley with Commander Migra. On the day the GES finally entered Goblin lands in full, and the war was properly kicked off. On that very same day as riders, knights, demi-humans, martial artists, and powerful beings poured into the forest. Forward! It is time for these creatures to learn their place in this world. Do not doubt your actions for even a second. It is their crime for daring to rise above their station. The King of Verdun has given us a task, and the Knights of Verdun will accomplish it. Oh! The knight commanders of every group gave their own speeches, and their knights responded in kind as they all marched on to defeat their enemies. It wasn't just them either, from the riders of North Balerion to the wood elves of Liasante. Everyone had their own little battle cries that they screamed out. Of course, this was a war, so almost every single action had meaning to it. All of these battle cries served multiple meanings: to motivate the troops that did them, whilst also intimidating the enemy that they were about to face. This was also something that the goblins understood, so a series of "For the King" cries were bellowed out as they prepared to meet the advance of the enemy. But the goblins didn't immediately charge out just yet, at least not all of them. Two of the chiefs did, though, Chiefess Jlug and Chief Gruul. With the chiefess holding a deadly command over water, and the chief being the only one who could command darkness, both of them together could inflict massive amounts of damage and a wide scale with relative ease. Chiefess Jlug in particular was gathering mana from the second the reports came that troops were marching towards them. There was no need to wait for any build-up, nor was there any need to wait for the enemy to come to them. From seemingly nothing, an entire lake's worth of water just appeared in the skies above the encroaching army. The amount of water wasn't anything to sneeze at, especially when Chiefess Jlug had no intentions of just dropping it from such a height. While the opposing Tier 7s were still quickly preparing their own countermeasures, Chiefess Jlug commanded the entire body of water to crash into the army, and at the exact same time, Chief Gruul made his move, and the entire battlefield descended into darkness. If there was a rule that the strongest of each force had to wait until a certain point of battle was reached before they acted, the goblins didn't care for it. The opening act would be theirs. 200, Roga, Book 4. Unfortunately for the goblins, it would take more than one preemptive strike to completely rattle the forces that have invaded their lands. There was a reason why they dared to do so in the first place. This is not like the orcs who lived in the Iris River Plains, who essentially never had to fight a real war. These were seasoned troops who had more than enough information to not be caught unawares by the plots of the goblins. This was showcased by the fact that the advancing party never actually stopped moving forward, despite the catastrophic abilities being thrown towards them. Of course, it wasn't as if the attack of Chiefess Jlug in particular didn't cause damage. It definitely did. More than just a few humans would not be returning from the battle as a result of said attack, but lives lost were a part of war. The advancing party knew to not only keep moving unless otherwise ordered to not, but they also knew how to throw attacks of their own. Use your mana to see, save and deal with the water, all mages fire at will, and nobody stop moving. Our enemies have laid out a welcome for us, so let us return it in kind. The spear of Tuval, as the most senior person entering the battlefield, there was little argument in entrusting her with the role of overall field commander of the entire attacking force. Each individual faction still had their own leaders. But if there were more than one central voice trying to command the entire force, then it quickly fall to chaos. The ferocious and likewise honorable woman simply wouldn't stand for such disarray among any battlefield she took part in, though. If the chosen commander was a fool in her eyes, then they would have to either taste her spear or obediently step down. Thankfully, it did not come to that, since the others in the meeting suggested her for the role in the first place. She skillfully barked out orders to groups as well as individuals, and on her command, the mages of the GES troops immediately began to unleash a rainbow of magic so profound and filled with mana that it seemed to fight back against the darkness that clung to lands of Mir. The goblins defended against the onslaught as best as they could, with the chiefs themselves being the frontline protectors. But that wouldn't work forever. They had battles of their own they had to fight. Balerians, Battle Plan Alpha. She called out a predetermined attack, and this one was catered to the riders of North Balerion, a group who were now entirely mounted and trailed patiently behind the advancing party, who was soon nearing melee distance with the goblins. Grafai, who has been sitting atop a massive Harkinian, waiting patiently, raised the lance he rode with in the air and roared out, "We ride!" That was all he said, but his voice boomed so loudly that the onslaught of thousands of troops storming forward, all manner of magic being unleashed, and the yelling of many goblins, elves, humans, and whatever else, didn't drown it out at all. Gone was the reserved man who deferred everything when it came to his uncle. Gone was the man who would rather not see a form of crowd, nor give any sort of public speech, nor accept any type of leadership position. This was a warrior. This was a general. This was what it meant to be a High Hark of North Balerion. The group of riders split into two groups and flanked alongside the main force on the left and the right respectively. Grafai hung to the left and his mount stroke out with ferocity to the waiting goblins. Whether it was bushes, uneven ground, broken trees, craters from the magic, lingering water yet to be dealt with, none of it posed an issue for the powerful legs of the Harkinians. The group sprinted forward, and the presence that began to leak out of Grafai began to weigh down on the area. It was a presence that only grew in its weight the closer and closer he got to the goblins. Mana even began gathering along the blade of his lance, but the goblins weren't just sitting still watching this happen. Of course, there were no riders among the goblins, so they would be at a disadvantage there, but since when did Roger, chief of the Ragur clan, care about such things? He was a goblin of duty, honor and war. He left the ranks of the goblins and took off in a mad sprint towards the force of riders approaching him. The most powerful flames he could produce blazed into life and covered his sword in a ferocious fire. There was no one running out behind Chief Roger. Although Grafai had many riders behind him, the goblins simply couldn't spare the type of force necessary to properly take them on, when there are other groups bearing down on them as well. Chief Roger would have to hold the line by himself for now, and he relished it. For the king, attack their flanks, I will handle him. Since both Grafai and Rogue were beings in the 7th tier, they could both understand the gist of what each other was saying. In Grafai's case, perhaps if it was another one of the tier 7s, a part of the GES, they would have heard for the king and asked where he was, but Grafai would much rather battle. He pulled on the reins of his Harkinian, and the powerful beast made a sharp turn to the left as Roger neared so that Grafai and his lance could have direct access to rushing Goblin. Meanwhile, Chief Roger, who has been watching and listening even as he charged, gritted his teeth before doing something that the other 13 chiefs would normally think was shocking in 9 out of 10 scenarios. He stopped his charge dead in his tracks, and instead of striking out the approaching Grafai, he blasted his flaming sword in the ground in front of him. Unfortunately for Chief Roger, who would much rather drive his sword straight into the chest of the man before him, he was not fighting for himself, nor was he even fighting for his clan. He was fighting for his king. There could be no selfishness when it came to fighting for the king. He had one job and one job only: to buy time for the return of his king whilst keeping as many of his brethren alive as possible. That didn't include engaging in battles with the enemy when troops were running past him. Not if it could be avoided. Dust and debris flew up in droves as the effects from a powerful strike of a Tier 7 Goblin showed itself. Graphi and his mount pulled up at the unexpected action from Roger, but they quickly repositioned for a follow-up attack, only to see him moving in a different direction and preparing another attack. Only this time it was towards the other riders.